Life. Dominic Hughes, BBC News.
More now on one of our main stories. Theresa May's ordered a series of meetings with ministers and senior police officers to address rising knife crime. Earlier, Britain's most senior police officer, Cressida Dick, said there was a link between falling police numbers and violent crime. But yesterday, Mrs May said there was no direct correlation between the two. Well, with me is Dr. Roberta Babb, a clinical psychologist and forensic psychotherapist who's worked with young people who've been involved with gangs. And I'm also joined from Glasgow by Will Linden from the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. They work to target all forms of violent behaviour, in particular knife crime and weapon carrying among young men. It's great to see you both. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. If I could start with you, Dr. Babb, here in the studio first of all. The suggestion is, and it's been a big part of the debate over the rise in knife crime, that gangs are a huge part of the issue. But it's not just gangs, is it? No,
I think the issue is systemic. We're looking at a community issue. We're looking at the issue of service provisions, that things have been cut. And actually, cuts have consequences, and we're seeing that in terms of the fact that actual young people don't have much to do in terms of engaging in youth services. There's cuts to social services, so support at earlier stages, and also cuts to mental health services, because being involved in a gang or group activity has a huge impact on one's mental health, and actually they also need support in that area.
Sure. Well, which takes me neatly to you, Will Linden, because of course we know in Scotland that there has been this attempted approach to look at knife crime as a public health emergency, a holistic approach to the problem.
Yeah, I mean, we started back in 2005 on this after we had a horrific year for violence. Record levels of homicide, record levels of knife-related crime. Glasgow, the knife capital of Western Europe. But it was that realisation that policing couldn't do it by itself. It was the realisation that if you wanted to systemically change the problem, you wanted to tackle the problem at its roots and not as a symptom. Knife crime or gang crime or acid attack or whatever that violence is, all they are is symptoms of something else. You take the knife away, something else could be used. The questions you need to ask is why? Why young people are getting involved in the violence? And also why now? What's changed? What's different? Also, what we need to look at, and what we looked at as well, is what was driving it. Is it just poverty? Is it just social isolation? Is it things like lack of hope and lack of aspiration? And to tackle those things, you need other people to be involved, and you need a whole systemic cultural change.
Dr. Babb, here in the studio, we know that Theresa May is going to be having discussions about this. Does she have to take into account those wider societal issues and not just look at certain specific things, some potentially pointing simply to gangs?
Definitely. I think if you're looking at the issue, you have to look at the system, because you're thinking about the different things that feed into it. We're thinking about things like poverty, we're thinking about issues to do with class, we're thinking about issues to do with deprivation, and like I said, mental health is huge, and these things need to be taken into account. Also, education. If you think about education, expulsion has a huge impact on a young person's life, their ability to engage in meaningful employment, and also the likelihood that they may turn to crime-related activity. And then that also has an impact on their ability to get a job in later life. So you have to look at the wider issue. It's everybody's responsibility, and to actually just say it lies with the young person, really distance ourselves in a really unhelpful way.
But that suggests that this is a long-term problem that's going to take a long time in order to deal with it. And people are looking for solutions as soon as possible, obviously, because we had, what, last year, 265 knife-related deaths, highest total since the Second World War. People want quicker solutions than, what, 10, 15 years?
And this is an issue that has been going on for generations. There's been youth-related violence in every generation, and the reasons, like we're talking about the root causes, are not new. We do know what they are, and people do want a quick solution, but actually we have to be thinking about the root causes, thinking about using our understanding to slowly shift and make different sorts of choices, and that involves all of us to be engaged in ways that may feel uncomfortable but are completely necessary.
Will, over there in Glasgow, how long has it taken for the Scots to get down knife crime, to be a model, frankly, around the world? It's taken a long time, hasn't it?
Well, when we first started, we said it would take a generation. We were quite clear about that. There was a number of our partner agencies and other colleagues would say they would do it in 2 or 3 years. Now, because you say you have to change things in a generation doesn't necessarily mean you write off this current generation of people. You don't write off the 15-year-old boy or the 17-year-old girl that are subject to violence, that have lost their lives tragically, because we have to do something in the here and the now. Unfortunately, that takes money, that takes resources, that takes the ability to make changes now to support people. But at the same time, if you only invest in the here and now and the quick fixes, you won't have the long-term sustainability, which means you'll have to continually invest, continually have extra resources, rather than actually think, how am I going to fix the problem? So it's both. It's not an either or. We can't just write off the people we have just now.
Sure, absolutely. Bit of a debate here, as I'm sure you're aware of. Cressida Dick, the most important police chief in the country, against the Prime Minister. Cressida Dick saying, yes, you need more coppers on the beat. Theresa May saying there is no causal link necessarily between a rise in crime and a decrease in the numbers of police officers. What's the situation in Scotland?
Well, we have relatively high policing numbers, but the question about correlation and causal links, I mean, I'm going to be honest, statistics can tell you what you want them to tell you.
Sure, yeah.
Basically, if you have a look at correlation, there is a correlation between crime and policing. There's a correlation between health and policing, and health and crime. There's a correlation between deprivation. There's a correlation between spending in education. There's a correlation between global warming and crime. So actually you can point to any figures. The reality of when you look at the evidence, once you get above a certain number of police officers, more policing does not necessarily mean less crime. It just costs more money. Policing is important. We also need to think what policing's doing. Say we were to invest in more police officers. Are they going to be working in communities? Are they going to be working with communities? Or are they just going to be doing investigation teams? If they're going into investigation teams, all they're doing is actually dealing with the mop-up. They're dealing with the consequences. If we're going to have more police officers or more resources, this is about working with communities. Now that could be police officers, but it could be community workers, it could be health workers. It's what we want to do and how we want to achieve it, and we can only do that with the communities and not against the communities.
I mean, Dr. Babb, you're working with young people who've been involved in gangs. You're a forensic psychotherapist and clinical psychologist. How do you change the mindset of so many young people out there who feel that they've got to carry a blade to protect themselves, that it's about using the weapon first and talking later?
A big part is actually just listening to the young person. They're using violence, they're using their weapons as a communication, as a symptom of something, like Will was saying. And it really is about actually taking the time to listen, not to respond, but to really hear what they're saying. And then you can have a different type of discussion which actually looks at their vulnerabilities, but also their strengths. These are vulnerable young people who are perpetrators, but also victims of circumstances, of trauma, of bereavement, of loss. And it really is about thinking about these things together with the young person in a way that feels safe, contained, but is also consistent and reliable. And that's why it's so important that services come together, integrate, and not fragmented, that actually long-term pieces of work can be done, because with the power of speech, actually a lot can be achieved, and it's really important.
Give me an example, if you can, of the kind of young individual that might feel that I've got to have a blade, I've got to carry a blade.
So many things, I think, come into this issue, and it's not an easy one to ask.
Sure.
We know the fact that actually people don't feel safe. So people think, actually, I'm going to carry a blade to make myself feel safer. We're also thinking about the fact it's a form of communication. It communicates status, it communicates intent, but it also communicates you can protect other people. It's a lot of things that are coming together. It may also be a way of communicating that you're scared or you're anxious. And it's a really complicated factor that I think if we think just about the blade, we're missing so many things that are out there, such as trauma, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, how people respond to feeling threatened. And that's a key part of this issue.
All right. Okay. Well, let's hope that something comes out of those meetings that the Prime Minister is having with police chiefs and the Home Secretary as well in the next few days. Dr. Roberta Babb here in the studio, and Will Linden in Glasgow. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.